Welcome to another presentation on Springfield's history. This one today will be on the first country club that was located in the Rountree and Delaware neighborhoods. This presentation is brought to you today by Richard Crabtree with Murney Associate Realtors. I specialize in selling older homes in the greater Springfield area. If you're in need of somebody to educate you on the history of your neighborhood and home, pre and post sale, or even restoration tips, I would be more than happy to help. The country club was basically owned by the Bennett family. The Bennett farm was located there, so I'll be discussing the Bennett farm, the country club, Muir Place, country club district, and Dougland Terrace. So we first jumped to 1876, and you can see on this plat map that we have C.M. Bennett, and Mr. Bennett owned land on both sides of what we would call today Glenstone. Colonel Phelps actually had land surrounding him, and then to the north you can actually see something that says Greene County with a dot. That was the poor farm, and that was where Pickwick Place would be located. Jumping to 1904, you can see there's been quite a bit of development already. We can see Hawthorne Place just south of Grand. We see W.H. Johnson. That would be William H. Johnson's Muir Place that he was in the process of developing. And, of course, we see C.M. Bennett, and we see a lake, and we see a dotted line which would be a bridge crossing over the lake. So in 1906, a group of investors, mainly ones who happen to live in that southeast part of Springfield, got together and acquired the 64 acres that was the Bennett farm. At the time, it was covered with pecan and hickory, chestnut, and walnut trees. Also had quite a large lake. The founders of the country club were W.A. Bixby. He was the president. Mr. Bixby actually was the president of the Springfield Traction Company. We have E.M. Shepard, who was vice president. William H. Johnson, as I've spoken of before, he was the secretary and the founder of Muir Place. We had F.C. Blackwell, and of course, everybody knows John T. Woodruff. He was their attorney. The Orders of Incorporation was put together in 1906 of October, and this is actually on file at the Greene County Archives. So when you get to the country club stretched from Muir on the north, Glenstone on the east, Portland to the south, and Delaware on the west. They limit it to about 100 families. They figured about 5 people per family, which would be about 500 patrons. Dues were $25 a year, so they were taking in about $2,500 a year for their memberships. The country club house and grounds were designed by Francis Dishler. Also, he designed a colonial hotel in Normal State at Carrington Hall as we know it today. They spent about $10,000 redoing the grounds and the house. Spalding of Chicago laid out the course, and Shaw's Garden in St. Louis actually helped design with the landscaping. Ian Thayer was the manager of a Harvey House. He managed the country club here in Springfield as well. Then a grand opening would occur on May 30th of 1907, and a who's who of Springfield was present for this grand occasion. You can see remnants of the original farmhouse, but they've added on quite a bit and a wraparound porch so that they would have a kitchen, restrooms, and of course dining and dancing facilities. The Country Club Lake, and this is quite interesting. This was a photograph actually done by William H. Johnson of his sons as they are fishing there on a dock. This would be on the Glenstone side, looking across the lake towards what would be eventually called Muir Place. The house by the fishing pole is actually the Bentley House as we know it today. The lake was fed by 2 springs. It was 1,000 foot long, 500 foot wide. You can see the Milligan and the Johnson home in the background. This photograph was taken around 1911. The country club was stocked with lots and lots of fish. They brought it in by the Frisco on rails and basically milk containers, and then put them on a wagon and brought it down here and dumped it in the lake. And whatever survived, survived. Mainly the young boys were the ones that would go out there fishing. Well, you had to get there, and there's only three modes of transportation at the time. Well, I mean, obviously walking, but if you wanted to have something take you there, the closest way to get here would be taking the Elm Street line from downtown, and then that would come down to Pickwick and Catalpa. And then from there, you would either hire somebody to take you over by horse, or you would walk. Of course, if you owned the horse and carriage, you could take it directly there. And those who were lucky enough and wealthy enough, you can own an early automobile and drive over there as well. This is the country club from an aerial photograph taken in the 1930s. Just to explain what you're seeing here, your boundaries, of course, as I mentioned earlier. The star would be where the country club would be located. The sunburst, the star is actually where that would be called Country Club District, and we'll be discussing that a little later. William H. Johnson, he's a very interesting fellow. He had actually went out east to an Ivy League school to become an attorney, came back to Springfield, was our first city attorney for a year, hated it, went down to Forsyth, Missouri, to basically sell land, timber, and mineral rights, was quite successful and very well respected. The folks that own Pickwick Place and Hawthorne Place asked him to come up here and sell. So that's what he did. So he moved back into Springfield, and around 1903 lived on College, and then eventually would move into Pickwick Place. He sold both Pickwick and Hawthorne, and he made enough money during these transactions that he was able to acquire the land to develop Meadowmere Place and also build the town of Hollister, Missouri. He would also later go on to develop Phelps Grove Park for Francis Xavier Herr. Meadowmere was put together on April 6, 1907. Him and his wife, Elizabeth Johnson, or Bessie, as she was known, they did 2 editions. This is the first edition that they had done that basically shows Pickwick, Catalpa, Fremont, and Meadowmere. He also built the gates that are around Meadowmere Place that are there today, the stone columns and walls that we're all very familiar with. He started these in 1907. He also planted about 100 some odd trees within the area. Always remind folks this is the Kickapoo Prairie, so there were very few trees in here. Most all the trees have been planted within the last 100 years. The Johnson house would be on the corner of Meadowmere and what we now call Weller. At the time, that was just kind of a grassy dirt road. In the background in this photograph, you can better see Weller and Catalpa. At the end there is 1151 South Pickwick, which is there still today. It is the large 3-story house with the horse ring out front for tying off your horse. In this bottom photograph, you actually see on the left a pergola that he built for his house. When he sold it later on and they completed Weller, that ended up in the front yard of his neighbor's house. The picture to the right, you see his kids with a couple of neighborhood kids, and they are actually down at the entryway off of Pickwick coming into Meadowmere, and they used to have wooden gates there. So if you go there today, you can actually see the metal hooks that these wooden gates used to hang on. He changed his house quite a bit while he was there. When his son and him were asked to redo Phelps Grove Park and make it a neighborhood, they had updated the house. They closed off the dormers and added stone columns and added a stone fireplace. The bottom photograph, actually from 1909, shows W.H. and his son James, Eugene, and daughter Elizabeth. This is what the house looks like today. It's been significantly altered, but you can still see the early reminiscences of what Mr. Johnson had built. Other homes that were in Muir Place is the Milligan Wood, now the Bentley home. Elkin of Elkin Sawyers had built a home there at Weller and Catalpa, and then would build a house 2 houses down. One of the most outstanding homes in there is Dr. Cheek's home, which is now owned by the Fisk family. This also was a home designed and built by Carl Bissman in 1934. Well, what's really interesting is that John T. Woodruff and Mr. Johnson were heavily connected with people in St. Louis and bankers and other investors. And they had a little weight in the United States, so they were able to reach out to Mr. Curtis and his new aeroplanes company and ask on his way back from Los Angeles heading to the East Coast if they would stop over in Springfield for a couple of days. Maybe there could be a few folks here that would like to invest in their company and possibly purchase an airplane. So that is exactly what they did, and for 2 days they were here flying the airplane. Here is the pilot, Charles F. Willard of the Curtis Airplane Company. In June 11, 1910. He's actually on the grounds of the country club. He got up in the air, did several acrobatics. He did slightly damage the plane one day, but was able to fix it. And then, of course, they had a lucky drawing, and a 90-year-old gentleman was able to go up with him, and they flew all the way up to the new railroad shops, the Frisco West shops, and back. Could you only imagine what was going through this gentleman's mind, thinking 90 years ago, or the last 50 years ago, I was traveling by horse and then started by train, and now I'm flying in the air. It just had to be absolutely incredible. Well, there was one very interesting thing that developed in this area, and that was the kidnapping of baby Lloyd Key. I will reserve that for another very long talk that I can do, but I will give you a brief synopsis. The Holland Keat family had a house there at the corner of Pickwick and Meadowmere, and it was a beautiful house built in 1908. They had a very young child and a little brother, and Buddy Keat was the one who was eventually kidnapped from this house while his parents were at the country club. Unfortunately, things did not work out well, and he ended up at the Crenshaw Mansion with the kidnappers. This is where Hy-Vee is currently located today off of Battlefield. And unfortunately, he was killed and placed in the cistern where he was found. The kidnappers were apprehended and tried and so forth. It was a big news event. It was over all the newspapers at the time. The only thing that knocked it out was the fact that the week of the trial, we'd entered World War I. The picture that we see here is a building that we're all very familiar with. This would be the old Wheeler's Furniture Store. At the time, it was actually owned by the Hers department store, and it was used for furniture and carpeting. Across the street where Maria's Mexican restaurant is, that happened to be Paxson's funeral parlor, and it was just not big enough to have a funeral memorial for Buddy Keat, so it was actually held at the furniture store. Country Club District was kind of the death knell, if you will, to Johnson trying to help Francis Herr out with Phillips Grove Park, because this particular neighborhood was more reminiscent of what wealthier people were used to in St. Louis and Kansas City. John Woodruff, this was the only neighborhood that he actually laid out. He did lay out the entire town of Camington, but as far as neighborhoods are concerned, Country Club District was his only one. So it took some doing, but he was able to acquire the property from Dr. George Dello, who had a dairy farm on it for the last 20, 30 years. And Mr. Woodruff saw the development here as being a great asset of offering great fine homes to the people who belong to the country club. It was bound by Grand, Glenstone, Meadowmere, and Delaware. Country Club District comes into being in 1912. Mr. Woodruff planned one of the grandest homes in the neighborhood. We're all very familiar with this house as it sits right on Glenstone, and it's a large structure. Unfortunately, today a lot of commercial buildings have built up around it. Many of you know it later on as the KWTO Studios. But Mr. Woodruff never lived in it. He sold it to Charles Martin prior to its being finished, much to the relief of his wife, who thought it was just this big English spooky castle that she did not want to live in. And so the Martin family had Martin Piano downtown. They acquired the house, lived there for quite a few years until after his death. And the kids had moved on. The wife wanted to sell the house. She was looking to sell it to become Springfield's first art museum in 1950. The folks thought it may be too landlocked and not close enough to other amenities, so they skipped on the house. Ralph Foster would acquire it to put KWTL Studios there, and he also bought another house nearby, which we're about to talk about. So since John sold the house to Charles Martin, he needed a place to live. And listening to his wife, he decided that maybe a cool new arts and craft low bungalow would be the ticket. So he reached out to Gustav Stickley in New York. Mr. Stickley was the main leader of the arts and craft movement in the United States at the time, and designed a lot of furniture and pottery, leather, copper items, and hardware for houses, and they got into designing houses. This particular blueprints are on file with all the other blueprints in Columbia University in New York, and we were able to ascertain some of that information. He actually was supposed to design 2 houses. He only designed the one, and that we see here today. The back plans of the house that were noted in this catalog that I found, you can see that match the house. Now, this house has since been restored. These were pictures that were taken a few years back, but it gives you a kind of an idea. Now, Ralph Foster, he would end up buying this house from Jude Simmons, and they had just moved from their large house, which was on the corner of National and Walnut Street, the northeast corner, which is now an investment firm. And they had lots of antiques. So the one thing they did is they dressed up the house more to their liking. Most of the arts and craft bones are still there, but they did add on a 30-foot bedroom onto the original bedroom. And because the brick didn't match, they ended up painting the house white, and they put the metal work on the house as well. But for the most part, you can still see the good bones underneath. And this was ideal for Mr. Foster because he could literally walk to work to the Glenstone Studios. Some of the other big houses that were built out there at the time was Henry Long's house. It was built by Carl Bissman the same year that he was also built Dr. Cheek's house in Muir Place. And it's a big booming structure, quite grand. This would later on be owned by Richard Dick Stahl and his wife. The Kennedy Duval Wells house, built by Charles Rule in 1929, recently was acquired by a family and went under a massive restoration, and it is just a fine example of that type of colonial house. Well, the country club had a little problem. It tended, like everything else in Springfield, it would burn, and it burned to the ground. We actually would have 3 country clubs there. This is number 2, and it was a lot more imposing structure that the folks thought that we would like to have. Now, what's interesting, they were also starting to compete with this other new upstart country club called Hickory Hills, which was also designed by John T. Woodruff on his Cherry Farm. But that would be another talk. The country club, you could only imagine paying 35 cents for green fees. That would be wonderful. And then, of course, they had dinners and dances. You could go out there and get steak dinners for $1. It was quite the place to go, and they would have all sorts of events, coming out parties and balls. People would go there quite often to play bridge and things of that nature. This slide was taken in the late 30s, and you can just to the top, you can see part of the country club grounds. You can see an oval kind of track there. At one time, they also used to do racing out there. I'm sure there was some gambling going on out there, although that would be illegal now, wouldn't it? But what's interesting is when you look here, there's nothing built to the south because it's still the country club. And when you look at Catalpa Street near Delaware, none of those houses have really been built in there yet either. To the far left, you see that rather large, imposing, almost like baseball diamonds piece of land, and that was John T. Woodruff's home that he sold to Charles Martin. And this photograph, this is actually also done in the late 30s, and you can actually see the overall golf course, very few trees. You can see where the lake once was. They had to get rid of the lake here for the same reason they got rid of the lake in Phelps Grove Park. The issue was sewage seeping in and contaminating the water, so they filled it in. You can see where they've actually kind of buried Bass Night Creek under the ground there, and as it meanders its way over towards Mexican Villa and then into the park. But overall, you can see that there is still quite a bit of undeveloped land. If you look at all of that south of Portland, there's really nothing over there. So then we end up with Dougland Terrace. Well, what happened is Mary and Doug Landers bought quite a bit of land in Country Club District with the intent of someday moving from their St. Louis house on St. Louis Street to the Country Club. Doug died young in the 20s, and their business partner, Mr. Nichols, he stepped in with Mary and helped her out with their dealings. And after the appropriate amount of time, they were able to take their portion of Country Club District and rename it Dougland Terrace in memory of her husband. And there were some really interesting homes built out there. This one built for J.W.T. Turner. This one is one of the few Mediterranean homes. Beautiful example, still there today. What was really intriguing about this house is Mr. Turner, for some reason, disliked the sound of steam boilers. So he actually had his boiler system installed in the garage, and the pipes run underground to the radiator system in the house. This is another interesting example of a house that went under a massive transformation. This house is the Dr. Glenn's house. Now, Dr. Glenn had originally had this Grecian salt box built in 1940. And you can see it just had a door and three windows on the front. And then the small little building on the side there was the kitchen. And they had a standalone garage out back. Jump ahead to 1948. And they have expanded the house significantly. They've added a room over the kitchen. They added a two-car garage. They added a room over that garage, and then expanded the front porch. By the 80s and 90s, the house had expanded yet again, a mini White House, if you will, with 4 columns in the front. But what's interesting is when you go in this house, you notice that there's a very small vestibular entryway, and you're like, why is that? It's such a big, grand house. Well, you have to remember, it was built quite small for just him and his wife in 1940. This house here is quite outstanding. Built in 1941. As I had mentioned, Mr. Nichols had worked with Mary Landers, and after her husband's passing, and then they would marry. And he wanted to have their own grand house to live in. So he picked the design, had it laid out. The only thing is Mary ended up bringing a majority of the house with her. So when you go inside, the staircase, the fireplace mantels, the chandeliers, woodwork, just all sorts of doors and things were brought from that house that they tore down on St. Louis Street, and made this beautiful, beautiful home. For the first 2 families to live in this house, it never saw kids. It wasn't until the last 10 years that a family acquired the house, did some restoration, and there was actually young kids living in the house. The house in 1941 cost $60,000, which was an extraordinary amount of money to spend on a home. But it is one of the grand homes today in Country Club District. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this short little presentation I've done on the Country Club. I do have a much longer version that I do on the Country Club and Rountree called From the Poor Farm to the Country Club, which I'll put up at a later date. If you're already not currently a member of the Springfield, Missouri History, Landmarks, and Vintage Photography, please do join. We are on the verge of hitting 18,000 members, and we cover a variety of topics, and it is a wonderful place to learn about Springfield's history. And with that, I thank you for your time, and I thank you for coming to learn about the Country Club. And with this very last slide, I just have to mention in 1939, we had yet another fire and lost the Country Club again, this time permanently. And it would be later become Country Club Plaza Shopping Center that you all know. Recently, it had been an IGA there and is now empty, but hopefully somebody else will come in and take it over. But that is my presentation for today, and I look forward to the next time we can be together. Take care.